So compounds are composed of atoms. What is holding the atoms together in that molecule? They're called chemical bonds. Chemical bonds come about because of attractions between charged particles. We learned that the atoms have protons and electrons that have opposite charges, and it's attractions between those particles in the atoms that cause them to stick together. So there are two broad categories of chemical bonds. There are ionic bonds and there are covalent bonds. And we'll talk about each of those. First, the ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are going to happen between metals and nonmetals. Okay, almost exclusively, we'll see it's a metal and a nonmetal. These bonds involve the transfer of electrons from one atom to another. We learned in Chapter 2 that metals tend to lose electrons, and nonmetals tend to gain electrons. So what happens here is when the metal interacts with the nonmetal, it transfers one or more electrons to the nonmetal. The result of that is that the metal becomes a cation, a positively charged ion. The nonmetal, by gaining electrons, becomes negatively charged, an anion. And now we have oppositely charged particles, positive and negative, and those particles, those ions, are attracted to each other. And that's what an ionic bond is the electrostatic forces of attraction between oppositely charged particles. When we look at an ionic compound in its solid state, it's composed of a lattice. So an alternating, regular three-dimensional array. So cation, anion, cation, anion. And they're just sticking together a lot like a magnetic building toy would stick together. So illustration. Here's sodium metal, composed of sodium atoms. And here's chlorine gas. Chlorine gas comes in the form of chlorine molecules, two atoms of chlorine stuck together. We'll learn why that is later. So here's our neutral sodium atom. Here's our neutral chlorine atom. Sodium tends to lose an electron. It will give an electron to the chlorine. The resulting ion is a positive ion from sodium and a negative ion from chlorine, and those are attracted to each other. And so they will stick together a lot like magnets do, and they'll form this lattice of alternating cations and anions. Those attractions between opposite charges are the ionic bonds. Any questions? So that's ionic bonds. What about the covalent bonds? We use a lot of prefixes and suffixes in science. This prefix co means sharing. If you co-sleep with your child, that means you're both sleeping in the same bed, right? You sleep together. Covalent has to do with sharing valence electrons. We'll learn what the valence electrons are later. But covalent means we're sharing electrons. So these sorts of bonds happen between two or more nonmetals. If you have metal and nonmetal, it's going to be an ionic bond. This is two or more nonmetals. You've got a sharing of electrons. Ionic bonds are a transfer of electrons from one to the other. Covalent bonds are sharing of electrons. So we've got two nonmetals. We learned that nonmetals tend to gain electrons. Well, if you have two nonmetals, which one's going to donate an electron to the other? Neither of them wants to do that, and they won't do that. So we're not going to form ions, but they're going to share some electrons. And sharing those electrons creates a bond that pulls them together, holds them together. So here we can think of it this way. These little red positive charges, those are representing the nucleus of each atom. So the nucleus has positive charge. The electrons around it are negative. So here's one nucleus, here's another nucleus. Here's an electron being shared between them. But this one is off to the side. It's not really pulling them together very effectively. If the shared electron is directly between the nuclei, that's going to be the lowest potential energy state. It's going to be the most stable. It's going to hold those two nuclei together. If we stick the electron over here, that's a high energy state. You can think of this a little bit like this being a rubber band. And here, this is what's normally going to happen. If you've got two things attached by a rubber band, the rubber band's going to be straight in between them, right? If you pull it up this way, you can do that, but when you let it go, what happens? It goes back to this. You can pull the rubber band off this way, but when you let go, it returns to this state. That's the lowest energy state. Any questions? So, compounds that have covalent bonds are called molecular compounds. Ionic compounds with ionic bonds are called ionic compounds because they have ions. Molecular compounds have molecules. Molecules are groups of atoms that are covalently bonded together.